I am going to take you on sort of a hypothetical journey to a Commonwealth country, and you'll have to bear with me because I was going to put together a PowerPoint, and then my scanning mechanism, I don't know how, I'm not as technically competent as some of the other people in this room are, so I wasn't able to put my PowerPoint together, even though I was up early in the morning yesterday and today. However, I'm going to read from some notes and I'm going to fill in a few things as I go along. But this is going to be a mystical journey to a Commonwealth country. And the country is full of contrasts, and all the way from the ancient tribal cultures to modern society and the population that exists in the cities today. It has evolved from probably 2 million years ago, believe it or not, and some of the African nations are quite a bit older than Canada, except for our Aboriginal people. However, you'll get some idea where we're going here, and we're going to be in the African continent. It is extremely difficult to paint a picture in words of what you should see if we had a PowerPoint presentation. So bear with me and use your imagination to try to think of some of the things that are going to happen. And this is a magnificent country. However, I will do my best to expose you to the magnificent Commonwealth country that I'm going to be speaking about. Now, yesterday somebody asked me what I was going to speak about. Well, show up tomorrow and you'll find out. And the reason was I wanted to keep it somewhat of a mystery, so you would be intrigued and say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? When you listen to the newscast, they don't tell you what's coming on the news until you hear it. And that's why Trump is so popular. You're listening to see what's going to happen next. Well, you're going to have to listen to see what's going to happen next. So you will be exposed to this country. And if you could imagine being in the presence of some of the world's largest mammals. And we can take, for instance, in Africa, in their natural habitat, think about giraffes. I wished I had a picture. Think about cheetahs, zebras, hippopotamus, antelope, hyenas, and various species of monkeys. In this country, there are in excess of 100 different species of monkeys. And all as we see is a few, but all the way from like spider monkeys kind of thing, little monkeys, to gorillas and even larger kind of thing. So not to mention the elephants and an antelope called the Acacia, and it has that specific name because it stands on its hind feet to feed. The problem being is that food is in scarce supply. So it can stand on its hind feet and get the vegetation that is higher up in the trees, and so that's kind of important. Now, not to leave out the reptiles and amphibians, but the crocodiles are very prominent in this particular country, and they feed on the wildebeest, and I'm going to mention that in a few minutes, but the wildebeest, which exist in the thousands, I mean thousands, they have more wildebeest in this country than we have cattle in the province of Alberta. And they migrate every year, something like our buffalo used to do. And the reason that the prairies got churned up was because of the buffalo hoofs. They didn't plow the fields for the buffalo and the grass to grow. The buffalo did their own plowing. And so in this particular country, thousands migrate annually, and they cross the Tana River. And in case you don't know where the Tana River is, it is in, nobody knows. Nobody knows. Well, maybe I can give you a clue then. It is in
Kenya. No.
Who said that?
I said Kenya, but
Kenya. Good man. You get 5 points for that. So Is there a Donna in our audience? I think it was Donna that said, well, you're speaking, and you did teach at the university, so is there going to be an exam? Yeah, there's going to be an exam. I don't know whether you ever went to a university or higher school of learning, and all of a sudden the teacher walks in the room and said, oh, I forgot to tell you, but there's an exam today. So what's this flag of? Anybody know?
Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good. I covered the name up because I want to remember myself, but it is Nigeria. Would you believe in Nigeria there are 300,000 infant deaths a year? A year. Mainly because of the conditions and that inflict young people. Tuberculosis, AIDS. Most of the births are happening in the jungle areas, in the rural areas, not in urban areas. And when Jane was here yesterday, I mentioned the one community in Baye, and they just built a maternity hospital with the capacity of handling about 2 births per day in a country that has multiple births every day. So, okay, since you're doing fantastic, how about this one?
South Africa. South Africa. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're too clever. Yeah, you've had your chance. Jenny's had her chance. So South Africa, yes. That's one of the Commonwealth countries, but that's not the one we're talking about. Now this is a big test, so get your thinking caps on. You're only going to see it for a fraction of a second. In 1956, the Prime Minister of Canada, and I wasn't very old at that stage of the game, but Prime Minister Pearson was the representative for the Manitoulin Island. And at that stage of the game, he was introducing the new flag. And finally, one of his office assistants, after weeks of deliberation and saying, what about this? What about 3 maple leaves? What about 3 fleur-de-lis? What about blue? What about red? All this kind of thing. One of his office assistants approached him and said, well, what about this? And that's how the flag was adapted. And he took it to the House of Commons, and it was approved only hours before the closure of the debate on the Canadian flag existed. So now I'm going to cover up the Canadian flag, and I'm going to ask you about that one. Now, it is the case that on the flags in our program, I think there are 32 countries have the flag of Great Britain on their own flag. Now, we used to have the flag of Great Britain on our flag too. When we went to the First and Second World War, we actually had the Canadian ensign, which had this. So, a very prominent flag. It is made up of what other flags? What's this flag made up of? St. George, St. Andrew, and St. Patrick. So if you put them all together, that turns out the... Now, you're going to get North American continent in the Caribbean. How about this one?
Jamaica, man.
Yeah, Jamaica man. And the reason I have to show you this then is my wife is from Jamaica, so if I didn't show this, then it would be a sacrilege. So if you have a chance to talk to my wife in the next short while, then you tell her, yeah, Gord showed that. And okay, the exam is almost over, so how are we doing? 50% or so? People get this one confused.
Because it's only 4 there.
He's from, guess where he's from?
The reason that it's New Zealand is because Australia has one additional star, a big star. So that's a way to recognize it. So that's Jamaica. Now, would you would you believe that I have a collection of flags? You might decipher this from the ones that I already brought here for you. But this is a very Christian-oriented Commonwealth country. How about this one?
It's got the cross of St. George on it. It's Malta.
Malta, yes, of course. And believe it or not, Malta falls into a very unique category. Britain, Malta, and I'm not sure the other, but I think there's only 3 in that category that out of that area. All the rest are from the Caribbean or from Africa. We have 14 countries in Africa that are Commonwealth nations. So the majority, believe it or not, of Commonwealth nations are concentrated either in the Caribbean or in Africa. Why? Why? Because Britain colonized throughout the territories in these specific areas for a couple of reasons. They wanted to grow sugar for the purpose of making rum, and they wanted to grow cotton for the purpose of fabrics. And so, and of course the slave trade. The people that were involved in the Caribbean, and in some respects even in Africa, were native Africans, but they worked for the people who were colonizing Africa. Okay, here you go. Oh, come on. Ireland. Ireland. The Irish, actually a lot of Italians claim to be Irish, believe it or not, because they got the same colors in their flag. All right, I'm going to have to reveal a little bit here. This is, but one more. India, of course. And would you believe that Indians stayed pretty much to themselves for a long period of time and didn't go anyplace? They stayed in India, and it's only recent that they decided to come to places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course they've always been going to Britain because it was quite close, and they were in the tea industry. So, all right, and maybe this is enough. This will be the last one. Pakistan, of course. Now, any persons, like maybe Colonel Taylor here, who has traveled the world extensively and privately, and maybe because of his military activity, Pakistan has been in turmoil for the last many years, but it has evolved as one of the people. Now, I don't want to end our examination without. Now, did I hear any accents in the room?
No.
How about this?
Scotland.
Scotland, of course. And we have a lady at All Saints Anglican Church who lays claim to the fact that she's Scottish, and she said, you know, kind of a funny thing, I'm losing my accent. I've only been here since 1948, and I'm losing my accent. I said, you couldn't convince me that because I can't understand you. So, thus the examination of what we have to offer. So, now you know that we're going to be talking about Kenya, and it has had a troubled past. But its troubled past has been mostly generated from 1498. How about 1492? What happened in 1492?
Some Spanish people got lost and they got helped out by some people in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Columbus went to the Caribbean and found, you know, the New World. Well, the Portuguese, they were equally as venturesome, and they went to Kenya. And so for a number of years, they went to Kenya and tried to establish activities in Kenya. Now, the reason that these European countries, or whatever you call Portugal, Spain, France, Great Britain, they wanted to establish additional territories because they felt they were running out of food, they felt they were running out of resources, and they had some of the best ships in the industry at that particular time, and Portugal wasn't that far away from Africa anyway. And the trade route to India was not that far away, and they had just not circumnavigated the world, but they'd actually gone around the south coast of Africa, and so they were able to go up the east side of Africa, and the establishment there was that they found, kind of good weather right on the equator, and so they established themselves in what is now Kenya. So, now get this. The mass of land in Kenya is 224,960 square kilometers. A lot of land, eh? Well, compared to Canada, Canada has something like 5,826,644 square kilometers of land. Now, the population in Kenya, its population is about, get this, 200 people per square kilometer. What do you think Canada is?
2.
4. Not a bad guess. 4 people per square kilometer. And so in Kenya already you have a density population thing, and it's even greater than that, because if you take the whole country into consideration, there's some of the country that is made up of deserts. Well, the people don't live there. They live in the towns. They live in Nairobi and other cities that are located in there, in that particular area. I want to mention some of the animals and birds that are in Kenya. Now, we think of Florida as flamingos. You see that on postcards all the time. Oh, go to Florida, see the flamingos. They're all pink. Well, in Kenya, when the flamingos go to feed, they feed on shellfish and crustaceans. And that's what makes their feathers pink, actually, over a long period of time, evolution, and the ingredients that are in crustaceans and shellfish. If you've ever gone to the restaurant and you see crayfish in a tank, some of them are quite pink. Well, the flamingos are pink because of that. There are so many flamingos that when they go to feed, you can't see the water at all. All you see is a pink hue of these flamingos. And they number in the thousands, like thousands. So much so that feeding time is a mirage of colors, and it's beautiful. So I'm taking you to Kenya, even though we can't see it. Imagine in your mind. And Kenya is a haven for other birds. And the registration of birds in Kenya is in excess of 1,000. Now, I took a survey, and this was a couple of days ago, probably last week or so. I was saying to my wife, how many birds come to our bird feeder? In Ontario, it's the flyway for migratory birds, and there are literally hundreds of birds fly through the island, like where I come from, on their way north or to the Arctic or wherever they're going in migration. And I would guess there's in excess of 100, because I've kind of counted them and say this, Baltimore Orioles, bobolinks, red-winged blackbirds, phoebes, bluebirds, robins. In Kenya, there's over 1,000 species. Now, you have to forgive me for a moment here, because I put something in my pocket and I gotta see if I can retrieve it. Yes. Okay, it's quite simple. Now, one of the things that I taught at the university is teach something complicated by using something simple. So, what is it? Oh, sorry. What is this?
Tape measure.
Tape measure. Well, in Kenya, ostriches exist.
So tall you can't even get the tape measure up.
I should have bought, yeah,
Here, Joe.
Colonel Taylor can help. There.
There we go.
Put it on. That's how high an ostrich is. That's how high an ostrich is. Now, okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, ostriches are the largest bird in the world, and they're one of the most powerful. If you ever run in conflict with an ostrich, it can debowel you with one kick of its leg. They have 3 toes, and they are extremely sharp. They can run, so don't try to outrun them because they'll catch up to you and knock you down. And they exist, but mostly in the savanna area where there's little vegetation. But they eat like crustaceans and lizards and grass and all that kind of stuff. They're pretty adaptable. But they existed before Darwin did. So he should have went to Kenya to study some of these things, and that's what I say here. But there are other birds of prey and water birds. There are cranes, there are pelicans, and then not to leave out, there are lions, there are majestic eagles, and oh yes, let's not forget the colorful parrots. They exist in Kenya. You must realize that in Kenya, there's desert areas, there's savanna areas, and there's rainforest. So you go all the way from rainforest or to the desert or desert to rainforest. And so the birds and animals that were there long before the colonization of Kenya was, these birds existed and evolved through evolution. And so if you wanted to go to some place that would be interesting, if you so desired, you could go to Kenya. Now, if you go to Kenya, you're going to be 1 in about 1.5 million people, because 1 in 1.5 million people is the number of tourists that they have annually. It is a tremendous amount of money that comes into the country through tourism. And if you take 1.5 million people and suppose they only spend $1,000 each, like that's $1.5 billion that comes in tourism. And Kenyans, the government, uses that money for the advancement of education and roads and railways and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of important that the tourism is emphasized and promoted. Now, I would like to go to Kenya, but I find out that they don't have any disabled transportation. If you're disabled in Kenya, might as well forget it, give up, move to the jungle and die, because they don't have that facility that we have here in Canada. So as a result, that in the rainforest alone, they don't even know how many birds exist in the rainforest because they haven't really counted them. It is a true paradise and nature at its best. And as an example, the creation of the gods, and this is not any one particular god, but the creation of the gods. And as a result, it is a marvel of evolution, and I said this before and I'll say it again. Darwin could have very easily went to Kenya rather than go to the Galapagos Islands, because there are equal number of rare species in Kenya as there are in the Galapagos. They just developed in a different way. Now, that's not to say that the other African states don't have unique animals, but you can see the evolution, and I mentioned already, all the way from the desert to the savanna to the rainforest, they developed and they exist. So, as a result of that, these species still exist today, and one unique feature, whoever brought this law into effect deserves a lot of credit, and the Kenyan government deserves a lot of credit. There is no hunting of big animals in Kenya, none. There used to be a trade in ivory that was phenomenal. It was phenomenal, the ivory trade out of Kenya. Now, unbeknown to you, and because of the lack of a picture, Kenya has access to the Indian Ocean. So as a result of that, animal tusk or elephant tusk coming out of Ethiopia, Uganda, Tasmania, all these places pass through Kenya in order to get to water. Now, unfortunately, even today, there is a big trade in illicit ivory. Most of it goes to China. Now, one of my contentions is the Canadian forces are at this present trying to decide what they should do with the disbursement of troops to Africa. My idea, or whatever, there are three animals that are under tremendous threat of annihilation: lions, white rhino, and gorillas. Now, if the Canadian forces had the foresight to say, we're going to send 500 soldiers to Kenya to help you train your soldiers to suppress poaching, it would be a great adventure. We would train their soldiers, we'd have activity going on there, our soldiers would bring a certain amount of stability, not to dominate them, but just to show our expertise in soldiering. Or any other country that needs this kind of thing, because as I said, lions, gorillas, and white rhino are on the decline and maybe very soon become extinct. So we could have gone to Kenya to see this phenomena of different species. Now I want to mention the vegetation a little bit, and the vegetation is fantastic and it grows in a variety of species. There's nothing grows really on the desert except some rooted plants, but there is one tree, and the one tree is now I'm going to say this and then I'm going to watch the eyebrows of people. The acacia tree has significance with some organizations as being significant as a God-sent tree or something of some significance to somebody. Anyway, the acacia tree usually grows in the middle of the desert or the middle of savanna, and it's the only tree around. But it's shaped like an umbrella. You've probably seen it on commentaries for travel agencies. One tree in the middle of no place. It forms its own umbrella to protect the water underneath it so it can survive. So it's kind of a unique tree, and it should be respected, and it's a tree of God. So this tree is mentioned in the Bible several times. It's mentioned by Aboriginal people. It's mentioned by tribal people. And it grows in the middle of savanna. And so that kind of a situation is kind of important. If you see it, you'll say, oh yeah, Gord mentioned that. Now, it's important to sort of look at the general location of Kenya. And if you can imagine Canada being in the center of 6 other nations and very limited access to the outside world. It's like Alberta being in the center of Canada without access to tidewater to get our oil out. Well, Kenya's not quite that bad, but to the north, it has, I just want to get this straight. It has Somalia on the west, because Kenya's kind of circular in shape, but on the lower part of the circle. Somalia is to its east. Then you get Ethiopia kind of to its north. And then South Sudan is also on the north. South Sudan is also on its north. Uganda is to its east. Lake Victoria is also on its east, although very limited exposure to Lake Victoria. And so they do have some fresh water there and a scenic spot for tours to go to and see Victoria Falls and, you know, all that kind of thing. David Livingstone went there to look at the falls himself. And we know that story. And then bordering on the south is northern Tasmania. And so it's surrounded by these countries. Now, Kenya has this opening or window to the Indian Ocean. Now it has an exposure of 336 kilometers, which is, say, from here to Calgary. That's all the coastline they have. Now I don't know how much coastline you think Canada has, but versus 336 kilometers, Canada has 202,000 kilometers of coastline. So we have access to lots of water where we can export our trade, or people coming into the country, and even internally through the Great Lakes, we have exposure to the rest of our country just because of we're on water situation. And water is very important, not only from an export-import standpoint of view, but from an immigration standpoint of view. Now, Kenya has had almost from time immemorial, tribal wars with all these nations in the surrounding area, like Ethiopia, Uganda, Tasmania. It has tribal wars with. Why? Because of the sparse vegetation in some areas, and the very fact that I'm bigger than you are, or you know, big brother kind of or a bully effort. These other countries want to take you over. Well, in tribal warfare, they use quite primitive weapons. So on an ongoing basis, before the Europeans ever got there, they had these tribal wars. But even today, there's the same kind of conflict because of immigration, because of illegal immigrants into the country, and because of legal people coming to Kenya, because it is the center, in some respects, of education, of development, and of trade and commerce, because it's the outlet for countries like Kenya. Now, just recently, and if my memory serves me correctly, as recent as, what, 2011, oil was discovered in Kenya. So now there's a need to get to portside to export their oil because they don't have the need for oil that is being produced. And Uganda as well. Uganda now has oil, so they need to get the oil out. So it's like us trying to get our oil out through British Columbia. Now, as far as the immigration situation, we missed a couple of days here, and I regret that we missed it. Would you believe on June the 1st of 1963, Kenya gained their independence? Kenya gained their independence only a short while ago. And they've been evolving for thousands of years through the people that exist there, and Aboriginal people, and people that colonized Kenya. So that happened, but so we started our conference on the 1st of June, and I should have said something then, but I didn't know that actually. I found that out just recently. Kenya is an ancient civilization and inhabits can be traced back to almost 2 million years. That's more than I can imagine. 2 million years. It can be traced back, you know, to some of the first humanoids that existed in the African nation, and they've proven this by carbon dating. Now, first, the real visitors that came to Africa were the Portuguese, as I mentioned, and around the year of 2000 BC, you know, 2000 before Christ, they established the language of Swahili. and it is universal throughout the country. But in Kenya alone, there are over 80 dialects. It would be like going from here to St. Albert and they speak a different language. Go from here to Sherwood Park, they speak a different language. But Swahili is a universal language that is throughout a number of the eastern countries in Africa, and so it has been accepted. And the language was established about 1,000 years after that to be the official language, or one of the official languages of Kenya. So we're coming to sort of an end. And since the real involvement in Kenya did not start until 1498, which is around the Columbus era, the Portuguese, by Vasco da Gama, reached Kenya and changed the country forever, because they were a Christian organization. They went there to look for opportunities for trade and things that the African countries could offer, and they were looking to expand their territory as far as Portuguese were concerned. And so as a result of that, they destroyed, there was a city, Mombasa. They destroyed the city and all the natives that were there in Mombasa. And what they do? They built a new place called Fort Jesus. And they made this a center for trade and commerce in the city of Kenya, and started to dominate the areas. Now, this was in 1592, so we've moved from 1498 to 1592, and this is what the Portuguese did. So as a result of this trade center and slave trade, which was very prominent, I mean, they had to fuel and get employees to work on cotton farms and sugar plantations and that kind of thing. So the interest in the African communities continued. Now, there were always internal wars. There were factions of local people that didn't like the Portuguese being there, so there was internal wars all the time, and it evolved where the Portuguese were eventually defeated by the local people. Now, if you can imagine a mechanized kind of a thing in relationship to people fighting with spears and axes or clubs versus firearms, but they were defeated. And in 1698, there was a major uprising. And then in 1729, the Portuguese decided to leave Kenya, because there was so much insurrection and war and that kind of thing. So the government evolved, and slave trade continues in some cases even today, believe it or not, even today. But in 1844, the first missionaries came from Germany to try and Christianize the people in Kenya. Now, it's been very much a tribal sort of religious orientation, and even today, the religious Christian organizations are intertwined with many of the tribal responsibilities and sort of kinds of things. We're coming to a close, just to let you know, so don't get antsy in your seats. But the European countries decided to divide up what was then known as Africa. They dominated several areas: the French, the Spanish, Portuguese, the British, some Indian influence. But they were very prominent in Africa, so they said, what the heck? Why fight about this? We'll divide it up. And Britain ended up, fortunately, to get part of Kenya, or all of Kenya, plus other places. They got other places as well. So the British actually established, the territory. And so once the British established that Kenya was, an all right place, one of the things that they were doing as they helped out here in Canada to build the Canadian National Railway across the country, the British people built the railway from the Indian Ocean through to the border of Lake Victoria, built the railroad. Why? Because there were minerals in the mountains. And so that's what they did. Incidentally, Mount Kenya is 17,000 feet high. So you get temperatures all the way from plus 30, 40 in the desert to freezing in the mountains. So unfortunately, internal turmoil has continued even to this day. And as a result of Kenya having their independence, they have evolved into a very considerable and a place you might like to visit at some point in time and become one of the 101,500,000 people. So I would like to go, as I mentioned to you, to Kenya to see some of the things there. As late as 2013, they elected a new president, and they have a republic system, somewhat like is south of the border. Now they've had democratic governments, they've had republics, they've had military coups, they've had all this, but they have finally zeroed in on the republic kind of a concept. And as late as 4 years ago, they reconstituted their constitution. In other words, they rewrote their constitution to bring it up to date. And so that's where we are today. I guess we can say we're thankful for Kenya, and we need to support them through the Royal Commonwealth Society to better understand their sort of area or thrust in world politics. They were one of the largest producers of tea and are today one of the largest producers of tea and coffee, but they drink very little of either tea or coffee. All that was exported to England, kind of thing. So there you have it. If I can answer your questions, I'll try and do that. If I can't, I'll say I don't know. So the floor is yours.